John Mortimer, welcome to the Left of Boom show.
Phil Wilson, great to be here. How are you?
It's great to be joined from the Great White North.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, some of your friends down there call us the 51st state, but up here we call you guys the 11th province. So, watch out, right?
Yeah, it depends on the day, but there's definitely some days I wish we were the 11th province versus you guys being 51st state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're going to have fun today. We're going to talk about Canadian labor law, which for most of our listeners, of course, are here in the United States. And I think it's really valuable to understand the crazy way we do it is not the only way. There's in some ways even crazier ways to do it. So we'll learn a little bit about that. But I think it's really valuable for folks to understand what's different about Canadian labor law, but also the ways that sort of positive employee relations and kind of creating great work environments really do translate across the borders. So that's what we'll cover today. Why don't we just start there at the beginning? So I know enough to be dangerous about Canadian labor law, but there are a number of different provinces that have different rules. And why don't you just explain for listeners, how does Canadian labor law work?
Sure. And the context I'll put this in is I used to have responsibility in my corporate days for thousands of U.S. employees. And I've got Canadian clients today that do business in the U.S. and we've had to interact with the U.S. National Labor Relations Board and the National Labor Relations Act. So I've got a high level of familiarity of the entire employment and labor law scheme in both countries, having had responsibilities for a long time in both countries. So the first thing is that we have a system where the equivalent of the American states, what we call provinces, and we have some territories, when I guess arguably you've got Guam and Puerto Rico, which don't have full statehood, okay? And our territories don't have full provincehood to equate that, okay? But what's different is that each of them has their own employment law, labor law, their own equivalent of OSHA, their own equivalent of the EEOC, for example. Now, the next place to jump to is, pointy-head people who study labor law will say that Canada is a Wagner Act country. Our labor statutes, all of them, all 14 of them, are built off of the U.S. Wagner Act. We have labor boards that function very much like your National Labor Relations Board does. It's just that we have more than you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So think of it as 10 provinces. There's a federal jurisdiction, the Canada Labor Code, which is kind of equivalent for legal experts in the U.S. to the Interstate Commerce Clause. So airlines, trains, trucks that cross either the U.S.-Canada border or cross provincial borders within our country, they are federally regulated. And then there are some other industry sectors going back to the founding of Canada in 1867, telecommunications and banking, based on the way the Constitution was written in 1867 as a statute of Britain. I mean, we didn't actually get our own Constitution until 1982.
Really? I didn't.
Before that, we were a creature of the British House of Commons and the British House of Lords and the monarch of the day in 1867. Okay.
Wow.
So it's been interpreted to put certain industries under federal control rather than provincial control.
And we have something similar to that in the U.S. The difference is, I think, the amount of jurisdiction that we do federally is a lot wider than the state by state stuff. So for example, and we're dealing with this right now, where New York and California have passed they all have like mini NLRAs, basically mini Wagner Acts, just like you said, except for their jurisdiction tends to be really narrow, like agriculture or public sector employees within that state. That's normally who they deal with. It sounds like the difference is in Canada, it's pretty narrow, sounds almost like the federal jurisdiction covers like our Railway Labor Act covers some of those industries, but then most private businesses, you're covered by the law of your particular province or territory. Is that sound right? Yeah.
Correct. But I think there's another really important difference, and you can update me on the labor scene, but in employment law in the U.S., employers are now facing states and cities and towns who are passing laws. So the era when a company like Walmart operating in every U.S. state was regulated under the Fair Labor Standards Act, for example, for employment stuff. That's no longer true.
Yeah.
You've got local governments passing ordinances, laws, all sorts of, and I remember this in my days of having employees in the US, and of course I couldn't just look to that one federal statute. I had to look to the statutes of Oregon or
Yeah.
Utah, for example.
I mean, yeah, it's really it's interesting, and in a way, it's the way that it's done in Canada. Like one of the interesting things, so like the provinces, even though they're kind of like a state, like they're much bigger, right? And they in general, and they tend to cover, sort of like a because it's bigger, it covers sort of like a bigger swath of organizations, whereas our states tend to mostly, I think geographically are smaller. They're also but like you just said, like they're trading all over the place.
They're still passing regulations that you need to pay attention to, whether
Yeah.
you're in Pennsylvania or Florida, right?
Mhm. Right.
Okay, so
And
let's go to labor,
mhm.
Phil. In
Yeah.
labor, has any state or any province done anything that impacts an employer that's different from one state to another, like captive audience meetings as
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's a big legal question down here right now because there yes. So multiple states have, for example, regulated captive audience. I just mentioned the New York and California laws that are, based on when the NLRB was without a quorum. Thank goodness we're past that, at least for a while. But they passed statutes that said basically, look, if the NLRB can't get its act together, like we are going to take over regulation in that area. But those laws in general are preempted. So there's currently litigation about both the California and New York statute. There's also litigation about these captive audience statutes, basically arguing, look, the state is not allowed to regulate in these areas because the federal law covers that. But it's a legal argument, and states and even municipalities are doing everything that they can to sort of whittle away at like what actually is federally controlled versus what they can control.
So the difference then in Canada across all aspects of employment, labor, health and safety, what you call equal employment opportunity, what
Mhm.
we call human rights in terms of the technical name, a business in the province of British Columbia does not face if it's regulated by the province of British Columbia, the
Mhm.
federal government has nothing to say.
Yeah.
The
And
city of Vancouver,
what about cities or states? Yeah,
city of
okay.
Vancouver has nothing to say.
Yeah. Well, that makes a hell of a lot more sense than
So it's really my experience having US employees, and as I've watched this progress over the years, is it's a lot more complicated to be in an American employer and have 50 states, untold number of local governments regulating you, and the federal government. So that's
yeah,
one thing.
yeah.
And the next thing that's really different is our labor boards are structured in law differently than the National Labor Relations Board. And I'll put it to you this way. It's a pure advocacy system like an American court.
Mhm.
The union makes its case, the employer makes its case, the employees who might be bringing an action make their case. And the board has an administrative process to deal with submissions, hearings if necessary, and making decisions. In the US, the idea that the union files, what is it, a complaint or a charge, and
Yeah.
then the labor board evaluates it and they turn it into something else. I had a client like inside of 2 weeks, district, maybe region 20, San Francisco,
Mhm.
just going off
Mhm.
of years ago, had my client's HR manager and retail store manager being deposed in their office under oath. And we were producing all these documents to the board who were proceeding against us. Okay. That cannot happen in Canada, does not happen in Canada. If the
Mhm.
union wants to make a case, they make their case and they go before the tribunal, the labor board. Either it's done in submissions in writing or it's done orally. So it strikes me that Mr. Musk and Tesla and, a few other corporations who've challenged the constitutionality of your structure. Your system appears to be the labor board is investigator, police, prosecutor, adjudicator, administrator of the entire system, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Nope, doesn't happen here. Cannot happen. And it moves much more slowly. That part of our system moves much more slowly. If the union wants documents, they've got to put in a subpoena, a request for them. And
Mhm.
they first got to prove the relevance of them. And they might have to deal with challenges as to whether or not they're attorney-client privileged. Okay?
Mhm.
The labor board will make a decision and then they'll issue the subpoena. But the labor board doesn't just listen to a union or listen to an employer and haul off and start grabbing documents and interviewing people.
Yeah. I mean, that's much more like our, just like our normal federal court system or even
Right.
state court systems don't
Right.
allow, there's not like we're going to subpoena all the information before anyone even decides whether it's relevant or, or abusive or whatever. And it's interesting, the new general counsel just came out with a memo, and it's been funny. There's been sort of like this negative reaction to it, but it makes so much more sense. And it's much more like what you just described, where it's like, hey, when you file a charge, you don't just get to like drop the document off at the government and then we just take everything that you said as true and then we'll start a
Start
whole
interviewing
investigation
people.
of it. Yeah. It's like, instead, you have to prove that the things that you said in your document, you have to like, what is your evidence that this stuff occurred before we're going to start a formal investigation? And the reality is, because no one's ever really been required to do that right up front, then hey, what's the difference if I just throw a document up there and maybe it's right, maybe it's not? I don't know. I'm just going to throw what I want out there and just see where it goes. Well, those cases now are going to get dismissed because it's like, if you don't show up within 2 weeks with, proof of the complaint that you filed,
Mhm.
they're just going to say, yeah, we're not investigating that. And that makes so much more sense than, what happens now, which is it sits on a file. And of course, now it's as bad as it's ever been, but it's like, it sits in a file for maybe a year or two before anyone can get around to investigating it. And then they find out like there's nothing here.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that the entire system of the National Labor Relations Act and Board is fundamentally inherently biased because the body is taking a position on things in every aspect of the way it does it. Our boards don't.
Yeah,
Next.
tell me a little bit about how is that different? How is it, obviously each side is making their case for their point of view, but how is that different in Canada?
So let's start with the structure of the boards themselves. So in the US, where it's a 5-member board and 3 members are pretty much always
Mhm.
tied politically to the party that has the White House, who's the president. And then whoever is not gets 2 seats. Okay. Doesn't work that way in Canada. What they do in the legal community, the management lawyers and the union lawyers, is there's consultations with the board, consultations with the government of the day when there's a vacancy or a renewal, and then they're going to split the membership typically between people with a management background or a union background.
Mhm.
And they're also going to try to potentially diversify them in terms of the types of sectors of the economy, right? Now, some labor boards are very small in Canada. They have like 3 adjudicators, a chair and maybe 2 vice chairs, we would call them. But a
Mhm.
bigger board, like in Ontario, it probably has north of 20 decision makers, what they call vice chairs. And then every board has a chair. And typically, again, over the years, if the chair is a union side person for one term, there's a high probability that next term it's going to be a management side person that becomes the chair and then a union side person. So it's not Republican and Democrat. It's not
Mhm.
liberal and conservative or, the NDP party where it exists in the country. It's practitioners from each side of what are the most powerful parties. There's no notion of representing employees. Our
Mhm.
boards all maintain this fiction that the unions speak for the workers. And that's just not true in terms of the way unions conduct themselves and the way the system actually works. But those are the power parties. So they have rules, they have procedures, they have forms. And whatever you need to do as a person who wants to participate in the process, you fill that out, you make your filing, and it has to be served either by the board or by you on the other relevant parties. Okay.
Mhm. Yeah. So
And then
so
and then they know the case they have to meet and they file what they want to in response. And then there's probably going to be a case management conference. Who's going to go first? Who's going to go second? What are the dates? What do you have to do? And so on. If we're talking about a legal dispute, if it's a
Mhm.
straight up application, like by employees to remove a union or a union to get a union or one union trying to displace, replace another union, all that kind of thing, they're going to have to put that stuff before the board and the board's going to run the votes if there's going to be a vote. Okay.
Yeah. And so like couple of questions. So the first one is, and I know this sort of varies by province or territory, but the process up in Canada tends to be, it seems to me, like a lot faster in terms of like getting in a union. when you talk about like the application process, that's a lot faster than what we do down here. Talk a little bit about that, and then that's different, right? Depending on where you are located. How does that work?
Yeah. So once again, depending on the jurisdiction, federal or one of the 10 provinces or one of the 3 territories, the fastest that you can go from union application to a board run vote is the province of Saskatchewan. It could happen in 3 days.
Mm,
Next up, you get British Columbia and Ontario, for example, at 5 days. British Columbia used to be 10. A pro-union leader government, the NDP, moved it from 10 days down to 5 days.
mhm,
Other provinces are weeks or months in their process before they're deciding is there a vote or not a vote, and then ordering a vote.
mhm,
The 5-day vote, the first ever quick vote in Canada, was put in Ontario back in 1995. And then that has spread a little bit across the country, but not every
mhm.
province does have that. So
Yeah.
before, there was lots of things that parties would do, whether it's a union trying to avoid a raid or an employer dealing with a union application. There were things that caused delay where, the vote might be 6 months or a year out. Okay. So we could have it much longer than it was in the US when you were up in the mid 60 days, although I think you've
Mhm.
come down into the
Yeah.
20s and maybe some quicker ones. And yes, there's been US experts who've come to Canada and studied and done meetings here and then brought this, quickie election model, as the US has called it,
Mhm.
to the US as an idea.
Yeah. So
Now, and of course, we have card check in some jurisdictions where if the union reaches a certain threshold, 50% plus one federally, 50% plus one in Quebec. And then there's other provinces that are up at 55 or 65%. You don't get card check unless your card support is up at a higher level.
interesting. Not just simple majority of however many they think are in the group.
No, some provinces, it's a guaranteed vote.
Mhm.
The employees get a vote unless there's unfair labor practices and litigation and you get a CEMEX bargaining order like in the US or a GISL bargaining order as it used to be in the US. We tend to call them remedial unionization or remedial certifications.
Yeah.
Some people
Okay.
call them automatic, but some people by automatic, they mean card check. They don't mean unionization because of
Yeah.
unfair labor practices.
Right. And of course, well, yeah. And as we sit here today, GISL is still the law. They're just added this sort of Cemex in between move that may or may not be lawful. We'll know here.
Yes.
Hopefully, have at least a couple circuit court decisions that clarify that some. But yeah, stay tuned on that. So I think there's a. I think people think of like Canada's way more unionized than the United States. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about like how unionized is Canada, and maybe what are from your experience, what are some of the differences between kind of the way unions and companies operate with each other in Canada versus here in the United States?
Yeah. So if we looked across Canada, we would have had private sector union density close to 30% a few decades ago.
Hmm.
Today it sits around 15 and falling, and you're at 6% and falling.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
So we're not in the private sector, we're not actually that far apart in the grand scheme of things today. And I think at one time, Canadian density was lower than US density, but US density has really dropped off. I think
Right.
that one of the most fundamental reasons is the Supreme Court in the US has said you can't force people to become members of a union as a condition of employment.
Hmm.
You, particularly in right to work states, of course, you can't require union dues for non-bargaining purposes as a condition of employment. You can't say, you got to pay for us to give money to Vice President Harris's campaign or you're fired, if I can sort of exaggerate but that's the dynamic. You got to pay for whatever the union wants to spend money on or you lose your job. Okay. I don't think you can do that in the United States, but in a right to work state, you've at least got to pay your bargaining services fee. You got to pay the minimum dues for the stuff that the union can prove is about bargaining.
In a non-right to work state, but yes, right. Yeah,
That-
yeah, you can. Yeah,
In a right to work state, you can't even charge union dues. If an employee doesn't want to pay union dues, they don't have to at
right.
all.
Or
Right?
fees or anything. They don't have to pay any money no matter what if they don't want to. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so in Canada, basically everybody who's unionized pays full dues. There is no notion of 2 levels of union dues anywhere in Canada that I know of, like there is in the US.
Interesting.
And so I think that that's given them more money per capita to work with. I
Hmm.
think that they are able to mislead employees into the idea that you have to be a member, you have to pay full dues, or you're terminated, right? And we have had labor boards where employees have lost their membership, and the union has said to the employer, fire Phil Wilson.
Hmm.
He's fired Phil Wilson, and Phil Wilson went and contested it, and Phil lost. Now, we have some labor statutes in some jurisdictions that say as long as Phil pays his dues, even if he was a bad boy, and he wrote a letter to the editor about the union that was critical of the union, and so we kicked Phil out because you do not write letters to the editor here at the Teamsters and criticize, you know, um, what's your Sean O'Brien? You do not criticize Mr. O'Brien, okay? Here, in a province where you're protected, as long as you pay your dues, and they kick you out for writing a critical letter about the
Hmm.
union president, you get to keep your job. But in some provinces, you don't. Now, the unions don't push that nuclear button of terminating people very often, but they sure use it. I mean, I've been running the Canadian Labour Watch Association for over 25 years, aside from, doing my human resources consulting work. And I've talked to an awful lot of employees that are threatened, misled, and intimidated by unions into believing there's risks in doing anything like that. Is decertification of a union harder?
That's what I was going to ask. Like, talk a little bit. I didn't really introduce Labor Watch. So talk a little bit about what Labor Watch does, and yeah, what does that getting rid of a union process look like up in Canada?
Yeah, so if we go back into the 90s when, there were some interesting circumstances where the management side labor lawyers, I think, frankly, had complete proof that labor board officials had lied to employees, had misled employees, had steered them in the wrong way on their rights at law. Okay. And I even, after Labor Watch was created, I took a woman who'd run a decertification at a high profile retailer to meet with the Minister of Labor. And the story that she told about this labor board official was outrageous. And even though it was a, conservative government in that province, they did nothing about it. Okay. So Labor Watch was born out of lawyers and industry associations saying labor boards are not serving the workers who are the least powerful, least knowledgeable, have no money. So how do they push back and how do they do anything? So we created an organization that runs a website that has the government forms for every single labor statute in the country from the relevant labor board. How do I cancel my union card? How do I remove the union? What's the process? What do I have to do? What are the forms? What are the mistakes? No fees, no passwords, 7-day a week, 24-hour a day, employee hotline, no charge that people can call and get answers. They can send emails and get answers. So there's like 80 labor board decisions with unions whining and complaining about employees being informed about statute law. And labor boards have been unwilling to strip the rights of employers who refer employees and employees who use the website.
Hmm.
Because I don't think they want to go to court and say employees don't have a right to know the law from a website. Like, we've got government forms. How can that be an unfair labor practice, right?
Right.
No one's been intimidated, threatened, coerced, or promised anything. They've been given legal information. They've got a government form. But none of the labor boards, they don't have explanations, proper anyway, but most of them have nothing that tells an employee of how to do this. What are the pitfalls? What are the mistakes you could make as a worker? And then they're going up against a union on a decertification who takes their union dues to fight them.
Hmm. Yeah. We have the
Now,
same problem down here of, the information about removing a union is like very hard to come by. If you call it depends on who you get a hold of, but like if you call these regional offices, you'll get everything from, you can't do it a lot of times when actually lawfully they can,
yes,
to just like don't do it, or I'll call you back and don't, or whatever. So having a place where you can go where someone is going to, and it's complicated, right? So someone's going to explain it to you and have the right forms and be able to kind of walk you through the process. That is, it's an incredible resource. And then on top of that, the idea that like you don't want to have resources like that available, and instead of what, like having employers provide that information, like that's not what unions want. And there's a reason why there's rules that say, like, an employer can't encourage or help its employees get rid of a union. Like that's on balance probably a good idea, but if that's correct, that the employer can't help, then there needs to be a place that will help, because the union's not going to help do that. And
Well,
that's where something like
they're gonna
Labor-Watch,
work against them.
for
They're gonna
sure,
lie to them, trick them, use their money against them, you know,
intimidate them.
hire a lawyer, yeah,
Yeah.
visit their homes, threaten them, and what are they gonna do? Sorry, file a complaint, go down to the labor board, unpaid, take days off work, face accusations about why you've got days off work, go in front. I mean, for an employee to go in front of a labor board in a hearing, without a lawyer, with all the technicalities,
Hmm.
this is the
Yeah.
joke. I'm
Right.
sorry, any lawyer, any sitting chair of a board in this country, any vice chair who can say that this is okay and this is fair, any premier, any prime minister, you have no credibility with me. I don't even know how you look yourself in the mirror and say the system is right and fair. And let me go here. If I have an employment complaint about my employer's not paying me overtime, I can involve the government, paid for by my taxes, to go after my employer,
Hmm.
make them produce documents, right? Initiate a process. An employee under every single employment statute, pretty much across the country, has access to government experts funded resources and, to do things
Hmm.
with the employer. Can't do that with a union.
Yeah.
So it's completely biased that only one statute leaves the tax-paying employee with nothing but fighting the union that uses their money to go after them. I don't know how anyone gets out of bed in that system, looks themselves in the mirror, and credibly says that's okay, rather than should all be actively advocating against it, because your kid could be screwed because of the system. Your mother,
Hmm.
your father, your whatever, right? And I don't think it's good for the culture of the workplace. I don't think it's good for the country in terms of how the economy works. But because of it, I think unions are less good than they need to be, if I can use that ugly English expression. I think it works against excellence because they can get away with things that no employer can get away with. My
Right.
favorite duty of fair, do you have duty of fair representation?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so we have it under almost all, but not all statutes in this country. Okay, so my favorite case, I can't remember the name of it, but the union gave advice to the employee that was dead wrong in law, like
Hmm.
dead wrong, and the employee acted upon it. And then they lost whatever they lost, and so they filed a complaint against the union for it. And the board said, union representatives are not lawyers. We can't expect them to know the law. They didn't fail in their duty.
Hmm.
Try going down to fair labor standards or the Canadian equivalent employment standards and say, I'm an employer. I didn't pay overtime. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't know I had to pay overtime. And you get
Uh-huh.
all.
Right. Right.
Sorry, what graduate of law school who practiced law, I'm sorry to all my lawyer friends, became a vice chair at the board, thought that you can say that the union rep doesn't have to know the law, so he gets off. And if I can go to a high level on it, Phil, a Supreme Court justice in our country back in 1946 was appointed to deal with a 19,000 employee strike at the Ford Motor Company in Windsor, Ontario. It was a violent strike. It was wintertime. They were stealing cars and cracking them up to block streets. They were undoing fire hydrants and flooding streets in freezing weather, and then streets were just being frozen ice rinks. Okay.
Mm.
So the federal Liberal government, in what was an Ontario provincial matter, got the Supreme Court justice to deal with the issue. And he decided on something that became known as the RAND formula in a single arbitration award. He said, the union doesn't get full dues for non-bargaining activities, if I can just summarize what the decision means, but they do get guaranteed fees from every unionized worker to pay for the collective agreement. And he called it, quote, the administration of the law of their employment. So to the extent that the union executes the Labor Relations Act and their employment relationship, they have to pay for that. But they don't have to pay for politics and everything else, is the way that thing worked. And that's
Mm.
been completely ignored. So if I can
Mm.
go back to my example, we started at the Supreme Court level on an arbitration award in 1946 that spread across the country, saying you pay to be represented by the union on your legal rights that you've lost to the union. And then we have labor boards not holding unions accountable for getting the law wrong.
Well, let's segue to employee relations. So I know we both care a lot about creating positive work environments. So talk to me a little bit about, to me, whether you're in the US or Canada and you want to avoid dealing with having a bargaining relationship and having to deal with the back and forth of that, the answer is to provide, a better alternative than collective bargaining and exclusive representation, and that better alternative is a great workplace. So talk to me a little bit in your experience, kind of how that works, and is that seen as an effective alternative for folks?
Well, most employees, according to the research that I've seen by others that we've commissioned over the decades at Labor Watch, says that employees would really rather not be unionized. And what's most interesting is that across the country, in the research, Canadian workers who used to be unionized but were working non-union at the time they answered the survey questions did not want to be unionized again.
Yeah.
Union research that I've seen that talks about, tries to research why will people not sign a union card to enable an application? Why will people vote no rather than yes if there's a labor board vote in a vote jurisdiction in Canada? And one of the highest objection that survey respondents had to the Canadian Labour Congress in that research was the union focused on seniority over merit.
Yeah.
The union doesn't listen to me was another one, right? I don't really have any control over the union.
Hmm.
What I see unions suffering from from a reputation point of view is that they protect people that fellow employees think should be terminated, but they see unions fighting for them. So what's clear from my consulting work, what's clear in particular from Labor Watch, is that if you're listening to employees, and in particular if you're listening to them about operational issues, the equipment's not repaired, the software doesn't work properly, work isn't scheduled, I don't have the supplies needed, the stuff's missing to assemble this thing, right? There's no chocks for the truck, and the drivers, those owner-operators who drive up here, get upset at us because it's not safe at our docks. Why can't we have safe docks for these drivers? Because they get pissed off at me or they get pissed off at the receiver, okay? So I see positive employee relations in the work I've done is most fundamentally is work actually working? Are you a top-notch employer operationally? Or if you are a customer, as you are of so many things in life as the owner or the CEO or the warehouse director, and you had that experience, you'd probably be unhappy about it. Sorry, so why do you run a building? Why do you run a restaurant that runs this way, right? And so, employees want work to work. Unions, of course, don't get to bargain those things, at least not in this country. They'll make promises to employees, but they don't get to bargain that stuff. But they get in on the backs, in my opinion, and in my experience, having interacted with tens of and thousands of employees over the decades of our work. It's that stuff that animates people to the point of frustration to consider signing a card and consider voting yes. And overcoming they protect bad people, right? Or they'll focus on seniority. And I believe in merit. I want my workplace to be good. And I want to work with good employees, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the same down here. And in an interesting way, just to sort of flip it, right? You talked about like that RAND decision, and down here we've got the right to work, states. Unions, when they do say it out loud, they like to take it back. But the bottom line is, in a right to work state where you have to actually earn the dues, unions do a way better job. They
Really?
work
I've not
harder.
heard that before.
It's
Wow.
yeah, there are a number. We have quotes. They weren't necessarily thinking about it the same way, but they're like, we have to work harder in
Yes,
right to work states, and that's true. Like, there's a market incentive. If you want to earn the dues, you got to provide the service, which that goes away in non right to work states where like you get the dues whether you do a good job or not. And I think the flip side of that is also true for employers, right? If you don't want to have a union, then you have to earn the privilege of working directly with your team. And the way you earn that privilege is all the stuff that you just described, right? Have a great workplace where the tools work, where if I've got a concern or an issue or a suggestion, you're going to listen to me. I know what my schedule is. I know, like, you're not going to surprise me at the end of the day and I'm going to miss my kid's ball game because I have to work late and couldn't prepare for that. Like, it's that kind of stuff that earns you a union.
correct. I think it's extremely similar in both countries from everything I've heard at conferences, everything I've read, everything you and I've talked about over the years. That's incredibly true. And the union model that creates forced customers or forced, extraction of money to people is anti-excellence. It's anti-accountability, as you just said. And I'd love you to send me some of those errant quotes if you're able that
Oh yeah,
you
sure.
emails
Sure.
beforehand, because years ago we brought a British expert, Professor Len Shackleton, over from the UK. And he was an expert on what Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had done and the impact of European Court of Human Rights decisions that brought about basically voluntary membership and voluntary union dues to be the way that the British legal system from a labor law point of view works. And so he said it definitely made unions completely centric on member services because they had to earn their customers. They no longer had forced customers. And that's my fundamental criticism of the Canadian labor relations model. We're the only country left on earth that I know of that has free independent unions and free collective bargaining that allows forced union membership as a condition of employment and forced union dues for anything the union wants to spend its money on as a condition of employment. And I think that's why many Canadian unions in the eyes of workers are not good, not capable, not competent, don't get the job done because they can get away with not doing a good job. They get away with lying to people, misleading people. And, the only good benefit of that is it keeps driving union density down. And as we get more jurisdictions that guarantee votes. And the biggest win, I think, out of COVID in our country is I think every labor board now is doing electronic votes only for unionization and getting rid of a union. So voter participation is like north of 80, often north of 90 votes now because people are just voting on their phones. So those are better decisions in those workplaces, whichever way it goes.
Yeah.
And it's just increasing engagement and participation in the decision making. But I think density will continue to decline. We have governments who will take away secret ballot votes. They'll accelerate timelines. They'll restrict employers' speech in order to help union leaders who are not competent enough to win votes. They'll say it's employer intimidation. Look, the consequences for employer intimidation are similar in both countries, and our labor boards mete them out on employers like yours do. And lawyers are constantly admonishing employers to limit what they do, in my experience. And I would say most of them do. But when it comes to decertifications, unions lie, and they get tripped up by smart employees with their lies, okay? And it adds to their losses. And so it should.
And the idea that if you make it really easy to get a union in and you make it really fast and nobody actually really gets to consider it and nobody really knows what it actually means, like that helps unions on the front end. Yeah. But it's like being a retailer where you have just like crappy stuff, but you just sell it really fast. Like at some point, the consumer goes, you know what? Like that was a really quick transaction, but this sucks. I don't really want it. And over time, that becomes even worse, right? Like the more people that organize sort of under the idea that it's this one thing, but it's actually not that, you end up, I think this ultimately is going to be the Starbucks lesson, right? You have all these people that have organized at Starbucks stores that think that they're going to get all of this amazing stuff, most of which is not even a subject of bargaining.
Correct.
And the contract, they don't have a contract yet after, some of these locations 4 years now. Whatever contract that they ultimately end up with, if the SEIU finally does agree to a contract, which right now they're resisting like crazy because they don't want to agree to something that isn't seen as a win, but like that's what you sold people and you can't deliver it. And going in, you can't deliver what you're promising. And so now they're kind of complaining, well, it's all Starbucks' fault. That's not true. The fault is the pitch to get people to sign on for your crappy product when like you can't actually deliver the things that you promise. And that's going to create a lot of people in the future that are going like, yeah, don't do that union thing. That's stupid.
Yeah. Well, and I think the Starbucks thing is even worse for the union if we go back to the start in Buffalo, where they had fake employees who were being paid way above barista pay in the background, right? We have a late friend who did some research that I think showed that about $2.5 million had been spent by the labor movement on fake employees, organizing support, and they went in there and I've met some of those people in person. I've watched them on video conferences and been able to interact and ask them questions. They were highly educated, university educated people who were not really a Starbucks barista, whether for a year, few months, or as a career. right? Because I ran HR for Wendy's and we had employees, with decades of service who didn't want the manager's job. But those people misled people and they precipitated situations, and it got a ball rolling that I'm not sure, to be candid, that's the Starbucks response of sending C-suite executives to mop floors in Buffalo was the right decision. I'm not sure that,
I mean,
and so it's just like this thing sort of imploded around this fake situation of fake financed employees, and then it went across the country and spread, and now there's no collective agreement. They'll eventually all be decertified. That's for sure.
yeah, I agree.
No matter how much US blocking charges, no matter how much the labor board abrogates those employee rights to proceed, you cannot block a decertification as a union in Canada like you can in the United States. A number of our labor boards are like, if you want to say the employer was behind it, you have to have a certain level of evidence, a certain level of particulars. Otherwise, you're getting dismissed without a hearing.
I mean, that would be wonderful here, right? Like the way that we block elections and prevent people from having a chance to, vote on, do I want to be represented anymore? And if you gave everybody the opportunity, there's some really great, labor reform that's been proposed, that there's so many people that are in unions that are being forced to pay money to them, that not only did they never get a say in whether or not they wanted to be represented, the generation before them and the generation before that, like nobody that works there had ever said, I want to be in a union. You're just
Yeah, there
forcing
should be
them.
a statutory legal requirement that every certain number of years, there has to be a full-on, properly run labor relations board vote, whether you want to keep the union or not. It shouldn't rely on employees who are not lawyers, who don't have professionally trained organizers, who are trained what the legal limits are to lie and not abrogate the law, but just slightly mislead people enough. I've heard about these training courses. I've read the decisions about what kind of lie is allowed and what kind of lie is not allowed. If our political leaders and bureaucrats and boards really believed in an excellent country and an excellent economy and the best for workers, they would stop making the least powerful party the butt of powerful unions. And they would make these people go through votes that would make them better or get
And
them kicked out.
and if the union had to run every couple of years like your legislator has
Yes.
to, they're going to work harder, right? They're going to try to deliver to the constituency. They're going to do the work. So going back to the, right to work, state unions have to work harder. If you had to have a vote every couple of years on whether you were going to continue to represent this group of workers, you would spend time representing them.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Oh,
Now,
well, I just want to close with one
yeah,
other
sure.
brief thing on mine, just on a decertification difference. We have jurisdictions in this country that are card check decertification. Quebec, the
Mhm.
employees have to file 50% plus one cards. If that's what they've got, union's gone no vote. That's
Yeah.
fair, okay?
Right.
Because it's card check on the way in Quebec.
Mhm.
British Columbia, Saskatchewan, there's a window. 12 months in British Columbia, 24 months in Saskatchewan. The window for decertification opens up forever. During a
Mhm.
collective agreement, during a strike, during a lockout, every day after 1 year in British Columbia, the employees have a legal right to remove the union. Manitoba, there's a window every single year for the employees.
Yeah. And
Anyways,
you're
right?
where down here, yeah, that's not how it works. There's a reason
No.
why every contract is 3 years long, and
Yeah,
that's because you've got like complete protection from decertification
correct.
for all but like a little 30-day window, and hitting that window is almost impossible. So it's like, that's why we have contracts like that. All right, John, we're coming up on time, but we have to settle the age-old question. How do you spell labor?
So we spell it like the British do. And last time I checked, they were fundamental to the founding of America. But I guess when you decided to throw off your British overloads, something called the Boston Tea Party, you threw the U out with the T. Okay. And we kept it because I guess we were just a little more obedient.
You know, I think the reason we dropped the U is because it's the letter that starts the word union.
Union. I've not heard that before. That's great. I love it.
All right. John, thanks so much for joining us. I know our listeners will be fascinated by like what's going on in Canada, but I think at the end of it, the takeaway, right, is create a great workplace and you can sort of avoid all this other nonsense.
Absolutely. Take care. All the best.
Yeah, thanks. See ya.
Cheers.